Hello. Here are some, I'm wanting to share some little viewing and reading tips for the week. Okay, so I watch a ton of movies, but they're mostly 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So I branched out. I'm starting to branch out a little. And so I went to 1969, a color movie. No, but every once in a while, I'll watch a James Bond movie. I love Sean Connery and his Goldfinger and Dr. No, and those are great to Russia with Love. Um, but I'd never seen on his, I guess it's on Her Majesty's Secret Service, 1969, and it doesn't have Sean. It has George Lazenby, who I think this is the only James Bond movie he made. And so I was prepared to really not like him. How could anyone fill Sean Connery's shoes? But the movie was actually really great. It takes place in the way up in the Swiss Alps. I guess it's Swiss, but there's this mountaintop refuge and hideous laboratory of the dark forces. And so there's avalanches and there's these huge action scenes. But 007 is strangely, he's a little bit vulnerable and he has a heart. And Diana Rigg, who's fantastic, plays of the Avengers fame, plays the love interest. And I won't spoil the ending, but he actually gets married. 007 gets married, which is completely out of character of any of the films. And it just has many more layers than the usual. The James Bond movies are they're almost spoofs. I mean, they're kind of formulaic and one-dimensional. However great. I mean, there's something about them that's kind of wonderful. But this was on a whole different level. So anyway, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, George Lazenby as 007. I recommend it. Then I had been reading, among other things, I'm a huge um, I have a huge kind of fascination with this artist, Joseph Cornell, 1903 to 1972. You may know of him. He is most well known for these assemblage boxes, these usually quite small wooden boxes that he made with a glass front and with just kind of seemingly disparate objects inside, like a bird and a dime store goblet and a spring from a watch and a magazine cutout of a constellation. But they're really deep and really beautiful. And he was a total eccentric. He lived with his mother in this totally nondescript house in Flushing, Queens, his whole life. His mother died when she was 84, I think. Um, he had a disabled brother, Robert, that he cared for. Robert had cerebral palsy, and he was collected just everything, stuff from the street, stuff from little antique stalls and movie stills, and he was obsessed. He was celibate, apparently, just about his whole life. He couldn't, it was just way too much. He way preferred to live in this kind of dream world. And he would have these very intense, unrequited loves, often for dead ballerinas, opera singers who had died in the 1800s. And he would find everything he could about them. This is before the internet, too. So he'd get all these clippings and photos. And so he had boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff in his little cramped cellar and just slept on this kind of army cot like a monk. Um, and just a strange, like, didn't really hated to part with his stuff, and so would give his boxes, would have an exhibit or a gallery show, and then would send a letter to the gallery owner, say, like, freeze sales. Like, I don't want to. He didn't actually want to sell anything. He wanted to hang on to everything. Lived on sugar. He had people would come and visit all the time because people were fascinated with him, and he'd have like one tea bag that he would circulate among 5 cups and then give them some kind of horrible stale pastries from the supermarket. Just lived on cherry soda. And so But I just love this one paragraph. And then as time went on, he would get these young assistants. He liked to look. He wasn't a lecher or a voyeur exactly, but he loved beauty. And so he'd like to be surrounded by these young women. So there was this one from Bennington College, Pat Johansson. This was 1961. During her first days on the job, Cornell, this is from a wonderful biography of Joseph Cornell that I just read, Utopia Parkway. That was actually the name of the street where he lived. How great a name is that for your street? Utopia Parkway, The Life and Work of Joseph Cornell by Deborah, Deborah Solomon, as in King Solomon's Mines. Just wonderful. This is great, kind of just tells you all the stuff you want to know. Anyway, so during this assistant's first days in the job, Cornell struck her as a charming oddball. It was the dead of winter, and he would toss bird seed on the kitchen table and open a window so that sparrows flew in from the yard. The birds ate off the table as Cornell looked on, as if willing the dream of his aviary boxes into life. He had this whole series of boxes that he made with birds in them. When you saw the man in situ, she later remarked, that was the interesting part. He lived all those tableaux that appear in his boxes, all of them. His art and his life, I think, are just kind of fascinating. So there's tons and tons of books about him. I've read some other ones. I think Dime Store Alchemy by Charles Simic. Is that how you say his name? Simic. Doré Ashton wrote a great book about him. She was a curator, I think. Dore, the first name, Ashton. Anyway, check him out. Joseph Cornell. Okay, and then continuing, as I was talking last week about one of my all-time favorite saints or saints to be, servant of God, Walter Ciszek, Father Walter Ciszek, 1904 to 1984, and I was talking about his book. He was spent, I think, 20 years in Stalinist Russia. Basically enslaved, incarcerated. So he wrote this book, He Leadeth Me. Also wrote With God in Russia, but the book that I love is He Leadeth Me. So, because he writes about, he doesn't have any self-pity, even though, I mean, he was completely unjustly accused of being a Vatican spy. I mean, of course, they just on principle hated and persecuted anyone who even believed in God. So, but he's talking about when they arrest him, he's in the prison, he undergoes interrogation for a year. I don't know whether he was physically tortured. He doesn't spell it out. He says it was at times painful. I mean, hello, understatement. But certainly the psychological, the guards wore cloth slippers. The place was dead silent, this horrible prison, Lubyanka prison, which was notorious for torture and executions in the middle of the night and things like that. But the guards would wear cloth slippers so you couldn't hear them coming along the corridor to your cell. I mean, just think of the terror. And he's there in solitary confinement too. So he talks about just like praying, Angelus, morning, noon, and night. Tried to say I mean, of course he couldn't literally say the mass, but tried to remember what he could of the prayers of the office. Did an examination of conscience, like in solitary. Did an examination of conscience noon and evening. So he's anyway. And they interrogate him. They'll come in the middle of the night. They keep him up for 48 hours sometimes. And they're just trying to get him to sign these papers that would be a lie, admitting that he's a spy. So he will not do it. He will not do it. He will not be broken. And then one night, there's this kind of weird word play where his interrogator kind of gets him to kind of halfway. Anyway, and the guy just swoops in, the interrogator, and says, okay, we just need to have you sign the papers tomorrow. And anyway, he goes back to his cell because he's more or less capitulated. And he is devastated. He says, I was despicable in my own eyes, no less than I must appear to others. My will had failed. I had proved to be nowhere near the man I thought I was. I'd yielded in that one sickening split second to fear, to threats, to the thought of death. When the last page was finished, this is after he signed the papers, I literally wanted to run from the interrogator's office. Back in my cell, I stood shaken and defeated. At first, I could not even grasp the dimensions of what had happened to me and why. He does turn to prayer, so he doesn't succumb completely to despair, although that comes a little later. But this is a thing that kills me, because he says he undergoes this conversion. And what precedes it is he realizes, he's this stubborn Polish guy, and he prides himself on his discipline. He is disciplined, and he does love God, and he's a strong guy. But he realizes, he says, if the interrogator's threat, because the interrogator said, listen, if you don't sign this thing, we're going to take you out and freaking shoot you on the spot. So he says, if the interrogator's threat had been totally sincere, then the moment had been a matter of life and death. In that moment, I had not seen death as God sees it, or as I profess to believe it. Just as I had always seen the sessions with the interrogator from beginning to end, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously, as a contest between his will and my own. So in this moment of total crisis, I had seen death almost solely in terms of self, and not as the moment of my return to God as it truly is. Then he goes on, he's quoting the scripture, Gospels, he who endures to the end will be saved. That is the conclusion of all the gospel texts, which speak of trusting the Spirit and worrying not in advance what we shall say in times of persecution. I had taken these texts literally and expected the Spirit to instruct me so that I might conquer my interrogator, the persecutor. How foolish and how selfish. It was not the church that was on trial in Lubyanka. It was not the Soviet government or the NKVD, the secret police, versus Walter Ciszek. It was God versus Walter Ciszek. And I was like, oh, isn't that the crux of it? And don't we so often, when we are in conflict with, for most of us, we're not in a horrible Soviet prison. We're with our family, our bosses, our landlords, our employers, our friends, our neighbor, our next door neighbor, and it's so often, that's how I see it anyway, my will versus their will. And you're just bound. You can't truly love anyone or wish the best for them if you're in competition with them. But if when we surrender to God, that, then you can love, because we're supposed to love our enemies, right? So then you can love without compulsion. You can't love without compulsion if you're trying to defeat someone. Whereas if you, because I have had tiny glimpses of this, where you just surrender, say you have a situation with someone that's just impossible. You have tried every which way. You've gone to confession, you've written inventories, you've talked about it endlessly, journal, spiritual direction, and you just can't see your way out of it. And my experience has been, when I realize it's not me versus the other person, it's me versus God. I haven't been able to totally give myself over. Like, what would happen? Who would I be if I lost? Who would I be if there wasn't this, if I didn't win, and therefore, in my eyes, this person, like, because the winning is underlain by your fear that there won't be enough love somehow. Whereas when you realize it's I'm just fighting God, then I can somehow just let go and say, okay, I truly have no idea. You have to just take this, take it, take my memory, my will, my understanding, whatever. And and so this huge load is lifted from his shoulders, and he just realizes. This follows on last week when I was talking about, his realization that whatever is happening at this moment is God's will, and we don't have to go across the world to learn to love or help people or whatever. And he just has this great sense of peace. He realizes if they go and shoot him the next second, that's fine. He's in God's hands. And they kind of want him to. They're going to send him somewhere, to teach like Marxism or something. And he doesn't even protest. He just says, "Okay, that's." He's thinking to himself, "Okay, God will take me there." And then at some point, push comes to shove, or they suggest something, and he just, with no thought, says, "No, I won't do that." And I think that has been my experience too. When you're in God's will, it doesn't involve a lot of agonizing and pro and con and back and forth. Like there's this very like on the moment, yes, and you let your yes mean yes and your no mean no, and not a lot of, because when I'm in it, that's when there's endless ruminating and what if I say this and they say that, etc. Anyway, and then after that, he undergoes more, like 4 more years of he's in solitary before he's sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in Siberia. But he undergoes more. I mean, the conversion, as we all know, is doesn't mean, oh, our job is over. I mean, there's more testing and more. But he really comes out of this incredibly strong spiritual figure, and the proof or a sign of that for me is he never talks about, just harps on, oh, I was unjustly accused, oh, and no one was there to take my side, and oh, I had no one to appeal. That's a given. He accepts that, and his whole thing is, how can I console someone else? He always realizes his problem is either self-pity, always feeling sorry for myself. I mean, who wouldn't? But he just realizes the spiritual danger. He can't feel sorry for himself. Um, or, yeah, he's trying to win. Uh, and his pride, mostly his pride, that how dependent he is on his will. Anyway, these are deep, deep, deep lessons, or issues that come up for me again and again. So, read He Leadeth Me if you like, and then when your head is about to explode, you can watch a James Bond movie and look at a Joseph Cornell box. That's how it works for me. Okay, I'm flying to LA on Saturday. I'm going to spend a week in California, one of my favorite states in the Union. Okay, thank you so much for listening. On we go toward Advent.